Evil. Resident Evil Code Veronica is a particularly curious game. Originally released in the year 2000 as a Dreamcast exclusive, it was revered as the absolute pinnacle of Resident Evil. Why? I am not sure. I guess because of graphics that were considered great? Neither user nor gaming magazine or website reviews of the time are ever clear on what is supposed to make Code Veronica or its slightly expanded PS2 port Code Veronica X so great. We either get long paragraphs of some interface-related minutia, which of course is nice but not relevant for the bigger picture, or some very vague statements like the gore is gorier, the booms are boomier, and guns are gunnier. Okay. And then starting with its GameCube port and going to the PS3 and Xbox 360 remasters, the critical reception suddenly became much more harsh. But again, there is no clear reasoning why, other than the gameplay style being considered outdated. But how much of an excuse is it to pan the game so much? Are other Resident Evil games with fixed camera angles and tank controls suddenly outdated so much that you can't recommend them anymore? Or is there something more beneath the surface? By the way, the footage shown in the review is from the GameCube port. The PS3 Xbox 360 remaster does some significant changes, including updating the entire lighting system, but since the game wasn't built with that in mind, we have situations where sometimes everything is either too saturated or too dark. And personally to me that feels much more distracting than atmospheric, though you might feel otherwise. Outside of graphics, there's no differences anyway. What makes Code Veronica fascinating is that there are a lot of aspects where it was the first in the series. It is the first Resident Evil game with full 3D environments. It is the first Resident Evil game with clearly defined villains directly influencing the events of the game, rather than antagonists that are an extension of a faceless corporation that would be the true villain. It is the first Resident Evil game to have direct 3D targeting, albeit limited only to a couple weapons. It is the first Resident Evil game to allow for double-wielding weapons. It is the first core Resident Evil title to take place outside of the Raccoon City region. When it comes to spin-offs, Resident Evil Survivor has a bit of a lead. For better or worse, it is the first Resident Evil game to delve into the lore behind Umbrella and shed some light on its history. Let's not forget that, cut content aside, before this Umbrella was pretty much just a corporation, and even the first game didn't mention the name Spencer that nowadays is associated with the mansion. However, the problem ultimately is that Resident Evil Code Veronica isn't particularly great at anything it is the first at, nor is it good at all the other things where it's not. It's important to understand that given the complexities of game development, this is not a slight against the team from Capcom. Things don't always go as expected, and as such we're discussing the product and not the people behind it. Nor doesn't this mean that you can't enjoy the game. This is your favorite Resident Evil? That's fantastic, I hope it stays up there. But this doesn't change the fact that I really don't like Code Veronica for what I consider to be valid reasons. Though I want to like the game, it has a lot of nice ideas and setups, and the atmosphere of some locations like the private residence is top-notch. It takes real skill to make you wary of every step in an environment with barely any enemies out there, and Code Veronica manages to do just that. But outside of some of these atmospheric aspects, absolutely every facet of this Resident Evil installment is mired with issues. First, Code Veronica is backtracking galore, and not the particularly interesting kind. The map design very rarely involves any kind of looping, so you just have to go back and forth large distances. For example, the very first puzzle involves you going from the graveyard past the security gates to an observation office, then back to the graveyard, making sure you pick up the fire extinguisher and preferably the padlock key on the way. so you could douse the fire and get the briefcase and go once again to the observation office, with the only little shortcut available being opening up the padlock gate, and once you solve the thing with metal detectors and whatnot, go all the way back to the gate near the graveyard to open it up. This kind of backtracking happens all the time. In the palace, you go to the display room, then without being able to solve anything, you have to give up and try to leave, and when you go far enough, it will trigger a cutscene with Steve in the display room. Oh, and we'll talk about Steve. And then you have to go all the way back to the display room, after which, once again, you have to go back to the main hall. It's just linear back and forth all the time. There is no path optimizing, there is no route finding, most of the map design isn't made for this kind of stuff. That being said, Code Veronica will try to provide an illusion of choice and having wide open areas. Don't fall for it. Once you leave the prison, there is a fork in the road. The farther path will lead to the palace, the closer one to the military training facility. Your instinct might call to explore the facility first. Don't go to the palace, because if you go to the facility, you'll find a bunch of items and rooms you can barely do anything in, and you won't even be able to access the safe room to stash items in the item box, let alone save your progress. It's just a waste of time, and some events don't trigger unless you pick seemingly unrelated items up. Also make sure to go through absolutely every corner of every room. The camera is not what you'd call fixed like in previous games with pre-rendered backgrounds, but you still can't control it, and the game's 3D environments with how the moving cameras are set up manage to hide various pathways and corners of a room with important key items, rather than actually showcase them from various angles. So be ready to realize that you're stuck because you didn't go far enough to a certain corner to trigger a camera change and find an item you need to pick up. The enemy design is also not particularly great. It is natural for a Resident Evil game to hide the full extent of dangers in the room for the purposes of its survival horror gameplay or aesthetics, depending on the title. It's not natural to have enemies with extending hands that can sucker punch you as soon as you enter a room, though it's not as bad as the boss design. First, be wary, pretty much every boss has a way to one-hit kill you. For some, it might be hitting you near the edge of the arena, but there's also one who obliterates you with a single touch. Literally. And then there are fights where it's just not clear what is happening. As is per Resident Evil tradition by this point, you will fight a tyrant, this time on a plane. What you need to do is to get the tyrant to a certain HP threshold and then release the box to push him off the plane. If you do it before he reaches the threshold, he won't be fully pushed off. How do you know when he reaches the threshold? You don't! Yay! Have fun wondering how many resources you might have wasted. Now, to be absolutely fair, there are 3 unique, very powerful BOW rounds that are super effective against this tyrant. They're really helpful in this fight, but to use them here, you need to make sure to not use them the first time you fight the tyrant on the ground. If you did like I have, well, sucks to be you. Which leads us to the biggest issue with the design of Resident Evil Code Veronica. On a technical level, it never leaves you in a purely unwinnable situation. But that being said, it's incredibly easy to fuck yourself over in this game, and you won't know you have done that until much, much later. In some situations, it can take pretty much the entire game to realize that. Remember the fire extinguisher situation I've mentioned you have to do in the beginning as Claire Redfield? Well, you're very likely to think that once the extinguisher is empty, it's useless and are going to leave it in the metal detector stash, which is not connected to any item boxes, but you won't encounter any until you leave the prison area and get to the palace, so you won't see any reason for it to take space in your inventory. However, in the middle of the game you switch to Chris Redfield, and in the very late section there is a fire in a weaponry room blocking off your way, for which you need the extinguisher, which you can refuel nearby. But you won't have access to the empty extinguisher unless you've put it in the item box, which means that at some moment in time, before going past a point of no return as Claire, you should have gone back to the metal detector stash to bring the extinguisher to an item box. You won't be able to do it as Chris, because the island you start on gets totally destroyed by that point. Admittedly, the concept of revisiting as a different character a significantly changed space you were previously familiar with is nice. Not so nice when you unknowingly can block yourself. Now, for what it's worth, this fire doesn't block you off from beating the game, but it does block you off from a Magnum, the most powerful gun in Code Veronica. And let me tell you, that kind of power is very helpful against bosses who can one-hit kill you. Can you beat the game without it? Yes, once again, there is enough resources for that. Unless you fuck yourself over by keeping something in the inventory of one of the characters. Claire and Chris share item boxes, but they don't share their personal inventory space. So if Claire has a weapon when you switch to Chris, and you have no real way of knowing when it will happen, yeah, Chris can't access it. Vice versa, because there is a moment after you switch to Chris when you switch back to Claire without warning once again, but only for a very short segment, and then switch back to Chris and finish the game with him, once again without warning. So just make sure you don't take something from the item box that you shouldn't. Playing Code Veronica is an exercise in frustration. Even seemingly cool features like double-wielding weapons are annoying because when aiming forward, the game also targets zombies that are lying down or don't have any legs and are constantly crawling, without lowering the respective hand, of course. So when shooting, your character might just waste bullets. But I don't want you to leave this review with an impression that there are absolutely no redeeming points to Code Veronica. In fact, it has really nice moments. The puzzle, where you have to choose portraits in the order of who was leading the Ashford family based on hints from a butler's note regarding their possessions and inheritances and so on, is really cool. And I can think of more than one neat little moment when taken on their own. But when you examine the actual flow, you get situations like having to find a piano roll here, which you need to bring to the casino lounge here, so you could unlock a music box here. And to get to the piano roll in the first place, you need to use an eagle plate, of which there are two, and both are pretty far away. Even though the concept of having to choose which locks to unlock first of the plate you find is nice. And you might be resilient enough to handle the game structure. But are you resilient enough to handle Steve, one of the most insufferable companion characters out there?
Relax, beautiful. I said I was sorry. My name's Steve.
He seems to think Claire has the hots for him, even though pretty much the only thing she ever says to him is either Steve or "Oh, Steve."
Steve!
Steve, 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 oh Steve, oh Steve.
But that means love, right? And a valid reason to try and kiss the woman without her consent while she's sleeping, or to just ruin everything while staring at her.
Steve, watch out!
No! It's toxic gas!
And look, I get it, Steve is 17 years old with a traumatic past, so of course people like that wouldn't always act rationally. But neither the writing nor the voice acting really convey the drama of the character, making it really difficult to feel for him and refrain from laughing in what are supposed to be poignant moments.
No!
What's wrong, Steve? Shoot him!
Wait! I can't! No!
Steve! No! Ah!
In general, the writing and voice acting are probably at their lowest point since the original Resident Evil game.
Please try and keep me amused, and do not disappoint me by dying too soon. I so want to enjoy this.
Code Veronica brings Wesker back as a superhuman being. He is clearly supposed to be set up as the main franchise antagonist. At the time, there was even new supplementary material released that recontextualized the events of previous Resident Evil games as being all part of Wesker's plan. but he doesn't really do anything here except say how much he hates Chris.
I despise Chris.
The real antagonists are the Ashford twins, who are part of the family that have formed Umbrella, and well, let's just say they have a really weird home video where it's really not clear who has filmed or edited it. And Code Veronica has a twist that even I didn't expect, and I'm not going to recommend you play this game, so I'm just gonna spoil it. Here.
Steve! A secret door!
After her!
This must be.
What? No!
Wait a second. What just happened?
So there never was an Alexia after all.
You mean he thinks he's two people? Okay, that's it. Let's get out of here.
So that happened. Then it turns out Alexia was in deep cryostasis in Antarctica, and after waking up she decided to ascend into godhood and mind-control giant tentacles. Yeah, don't ask. The T-virus and G-virus infections in previous games were all about mutations and transformations into abominations. But Code Veronica also introduces literal superpowers into the mix, and in combination with the game's writing and voice acting, it just looks and feels incredibly ridiculous. I don't want this video to transform into here's all the complaints I have about Code Veronica, and I think I have provided enough arguments and examples that will help you understand why I will score the game with my Stasocritic rating system the way I will. The first category of the system is design, and it has a weight of 4 since the way a game is played and structured is what defines our experience the most. I will assign a 2. Conceptually, Code Veronica does have potential. In practice, absolutely every facet of design is mired with issues: map layouts, resource management, puzzles, boss battles, exploration, flow. There is absolutely nothing that isn't various stages of problematic. A very frustrating experience. And yet, when it comes to the next category, emotions, which has a weight of 3, I will assign a score of 3. I didn't want to hate Code Veronica. In fact, I often saw glimmers of a game I could really enjoy, but sadly, I did not. Next we have cohesion, a category with a weight of 2 that's all about how well different aspects of a game are connected to each other for the purposes of a singular, wholesome experience. I will assign a 4. There is actually some nice contextualization regarding why certain things are the way they are, but ultimately, too many aspects live in this area of, oh, it's a Resident Evil game and that's just how things work in Resident Evil, and too many other aspects are just arbitrary. Though at least that part is still more impressive than the plot, which is part of the context category that's also about characters, arcs, lore, and all that kind of stuff. I will assign a 1. Code Veronica doesn't make any sense. Story, world building, villains, everything is just ridiculous without redeeming qualities that could make it work. And finally, we have aesthetics, where I will assign a 6. Technology of Code Veronica is indeed impressive, and I can see how going from low-poly textured faces of the previous games to actually detailed models of this one could have been seen as incredibly impressive. And from a technical standpoint, it is. But aesthetics is not just about technology. And while the game is not devoid of atmosphere, we can't forget that it has bad voice acting, facial animation is very stilted while being focused on a lot, sound design is often very boring, and a bunch of environments are just a collection of bland grey stuff. Technology is temporary, while style is forever, and Code Veronica doesn't have a lot of that. In the end, should we calculate all the scores and their weights together, Code Veronica is going to get a final Stasocritic rating of 29. And look, I often say how Stasocritic is not Metacritic and the entire score range is used. So 29 is not absolutely abysmal, but it is pretty bad. You have to be a person of particular tastes and interests to be able to ignore or forgive all the issues that Code Veronica has, and if you're among them, congratulations! As far as I'm concerned, a power to enjoy a game is the greatest one there is when it comes to this medium. Sadly, with Code Veronica, I don't have it. And I don't know if a lot of people back in the day did. Let's not forget that for all of its initially positive reception, people were very quick to change their shoes and start calling Resident Evil Code Veronica outdated. This was definitely an important catalyst of the conversation whether the franchise needed a significant change, which it would eventually receive. But I also think that there has been a pretty huge misunderstanding, as maybe what people actually had issues with were not the classic Resident Evil design principles, but their poor implementation in Code Veronica specifically. But I guess we'll never know. At any rate, thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and don't forget to comment your thoughts below.